Hello and welcome to the Online College of Coding video tutorial series. This is video 2 in the series on getting started with Unity 3D. In this video we'll be looking at the Unity interface and creating our first project. Before starting this video we recommend that you have installed and registered your copy of Unity. So let's get started. Okay, so here we are with Unity open. When we open it for the first time we can see that we can either open an existing project or we can create a new project. When you create a new project, you give it a name and location for where it's going to be saved, but more specifically you need to tell it whether it's going to be a 3D project or a 2D project based on the type of game you're creating. We're going to be creating a 2D game for our introduction to Unity. Okay, so now that our blank Unity game has started, let's have a look at the main sections of our Unity 3D interface. Up the top is our toolbar. Down the left-hand side is our hierarchy. In the center is our scene or game view. Over the right-hand side is our inspector. And down the bottom is our project or console view. If we have a look up the top, we can see, like any Windows application, we've got a menu system, which includes File and Help, like most Windows applications do, but includes some others which are specific to Unity. To get started, click on the Game Object menu, go down to 3D Object and select Cube. So from here, let's have a look at our scene or game view. And if we click on 2D, you'll see that we're back to the 2D representation of our game view. If we click on the same button again, we can now see that same cube in a 3D view. Starting with Move, if you select the Move button, you can see these green, blue and red arrows have changed so that we can now select those as handles to move our object around. If we click on the one beside it, which is our Rotate button, the gizmo changes so that we can rotate our object around. The button beside it is our Scale tool, and we can scale or resize our object in any of its dimensions. So take a minute or two now to create a few additional 3D game objects, like your cube and sphere, and try a capsule or a cylinder. And with those, once you've created them, try using the transform tools to move, rotate and scale them. So now that you've created a few 3D game objects in your scene view, you can see them represented over here in your hierarchy. Your hierarchy lists all of the game objects that are in your current scene. At the moment we've got 4 objects. Now one of the key features of the hierarchy is the fact that you can have objects that are parented to each other. That means that if I get this object, like for instance this sphere, and I drag it up onto my cube, you'll see now that this little arrow here is representing the fact that the cube is a parent to this sphere. So what that means is if I select that cube and I use some of my transform tools here, whatever I do to my cube will also occur to my sphere. So I can move or rotate or scale those objects, and whatever you do to the parent, it will do the child. Now working in conjunction with your hierarchy and your scene view is the inspector, and if you select anything from in your hierarchy or scene view, the details will show up in the inspector. So let's select our cube. In our inspector we can see all of the components of that cube and all of the details of those components. We can see that there are currently 4 components to that cube. It's transform, a mesh filter, a box collider and a mesh renderer. So I want you to take a few moments to modify the transform values of your cube to reflect those that are shown here in this video. So press pause on the video now and change the details in your inspector for that cube. So now do the same thing with a capsule and a sphere, and pause the video so that you can modify the transform values of the capsule and your sphere to represent those that are shown in the video. Game objects are very important and they make up everything that you see in your scene. They can include 3D meshes, planes, lights, cameras, textures and sprites, and even empty game objects. Let's go and create another game object, this time by in the hierarchy, clicking on Create and selecting it from this menu. Going to 3D Object, and let's make another cube. And this last one, set it to 0, 12, and 0, and you can set the last settings to whichever you like. So now before we finish this video, we've got a couple more activities to do where we're going to use the skills that we've learned so far. The first thing we want to do is modify the transform properties of our camera. So select your camera and over in the inspector, set them to the following details. And so now with our main camera selected in our hierarchy, we can see from our camera preview that all of our objects that we've created are now sitting vertically above each other, out of view from our camera. The next step we want to do is create a plane. So we click on Create, 3D Object and Plane. And then over in our transform values for that object in the inspector, set them to the following, which is 0, -5, and 0. The next thing we want to do is add some lighting to our scene. Without lighting, the objects aren't going to be shown very clearly, and we can do that by clicking on Create, Light, and we're going to choose specifically a directional light. Now, just for the purposes of our activity, just set them to the following values of 0, 0, 0 for its position, of 50, 330, and 0 for rotation, and then 1, 1, 1 for the scale. And finally, we want to add a component called a rigid body to the 4 main game objects that we created earlier. A rigid body is going to make those game objects behave like they would if they were a real 3D object within a world, so that will add some things like gravity basically to those objects. In the hierarchy, you can select cube, capsule, sphere, and the second cube by pressing and holding Control and then clicking on each of those. Then click Add Component, and if you start typing in rigid body, select rigid body from its available list here, and now to those 4 game objects you've added that particular component. And now, after all our hard work, we can click on Play up in our toolbar and check out what our game looks like. And you can see the rigid body component of those 4 game objects affecting those objects, and they fall down and land on our plane. So well done. And that concludes video 2 of our Introduction to Unity 3D. In our next video, we're going to be creating our first C# script to add some interactivity to this first game.